The hall had held its breath since she stepped onto the dais. 300 wolves, ranked by bloodline and bond status, stood in their prescribed positions along the walls of the Ironhold throne room, and not one of them looked at her the way they looked at each other. They looked at her the way people look at a thing they have already decided does not matter, a glance held just long enough to confirm the decision and then moved on. Alistair had learned to feel that kind of looking years ago, when her pack's lands were stripped and the creditor elders came to assess what remained. She had stood in a doorway then, too, 12 years old and barefoot on cold stone, while men with ledgers noted everything her family had left. She knew the weight of that particular inventory. She carried it still, packed somewhere behind her sternum where it did not show. What she had not expected was him. Calder, Alpha King of the Ironhold, did not sit on his throne the way the stories described. He stood beside it, one hand resting at his side, the other at the carved arm of the stone chair, as though he had simply stopped there mid-thought and found no reason to move. He was watching the ceremony with the particular stillness of a man who has never once needed to announce himself because every room he enters already knows. The air around him had a different quality. It was not warmth, it was pressure, the way a held breath is pressure, quiet and absolute and difficult to explain after the fact. Alistair kept her eyes on the council table, where Elder Merrin sat with her white banded sleeves arranged across the surface of the carved mahogany, like a woman who had been waiting a long time for this moment. Merrin was the one who had come to Alistair's pack seat 3 months ago, with 3 attendants and a rolled parchment, and the patient expression of someone delivering news they have delivered many times before. The fallen pack's debt to the Ironhold was 3 generations deep. The tribute terms allowed for a living representative, someone of blood, to serve at court in place of the final land forfeiture. Alistair had read the terms twice, standing in the cold kitchen of what remained of her family's hall, and then she had looked at Vera, her younger sister, asleep at the table with her head on her folded arms, and she had picked up the pen. Elder Merrin rose when Alistair's name was called. "The Fallen Pack's charity," Merrin said, her voice carrying to every corner of the hall with the ease of long practice. "Presented to the Ironhold Court in settlement of the 7th generation blood debt. Let the council record her arrival and her standing." Her standing. Alistair heard the particular shape of that phrase, the way it was formed to mean the opposite of what it said. The Fallen Pack's charity. She felt the 300 assembled wolves receive that naming, watched the phrase pass through the room like a stone dropped in still water, the ring spreading out and out. She did not move. She did not allow her hands to close. Across the hall, behind the rows of ranked attendants, Devon, Calder's beta, stood at the edge of the torchlight with his arms folded and his eyes on the Alpha King's face. He registered something in that moment, though Alistair did not know it then. Calder's stillness had shifted, almost nothing, a fraction of degree, as though a weight had settled somewhere it had not been before. The ceremony concluded with the council's formal notation and the tolling of the Ironhold bell, a single low note that traveled through the stone floor and up through the soles of Alistair's feet. She was assigned a chamber in the tribute wing, shown there by a silent attendant, and left with a narrow window that looked over the inner courtyard. The room was not unkind. The bed had clean linens and the hearth held a week's worth of pressed wood. Someone had arranged a candle on the table and a basin of warm water. She was not sure who had ordered that. She would learn later that Devon had passed the instruction to the chamberlain himself, acting on a single quiet sentence from Calder, issued while the ceremony was still concluding, and the bell's resonance still moved through the hall. She did not know that for weeks. At the time, she only thought that someone had made an error of assignment, that the room was meant for a guest of higher standing, and that she should not become accustomed to it. The first 2 weeks at the Ironhold taught her the geography of being invisible. She attended the morning council observations required of all tribute representatives, stood in the designated position along the eastern wall, and watched the court administer itself. She learned the names of the council members. She learned the carved seals above each doorway, the family marks of the 4 founding packs, and the Ironhold's own blazon. She learned where Marin sat, and where Lyra, daughter of the Eastern Pack's leading house, sat. And she learned the precise quality of ease with which both women occupied their chairs, the ease of people who have never had occasion to wonder whether their presence was warranted. Lyra arrived at court in the 2nd week, traveling with a delegation of 8, and she was, by any court-visible measure, everything Alistair was not. Her bond marks were double silver, her standing with the Eastern Alliance was long established, and she wore her standing the way a coat fits when it has been made to order. She moved through the throne hall with the particular confidence of a woman who has been told, many times, that the most powerful man in this world is eventually going to look at her. She looked at Alistair once, in the corridor outside the council chamber, and the look held a specific quality of assessment before it moved on. Alistair had seen that look before too. Calder did not speak to Alistair in those first 2 weeks. He passed through rooms she occupied, issued instructions to Devon or to the chamberlain, reviewed the council's presentations, and moved through his court with the economy of someone who has learned not to waste motion. He was aware of her in the way a man is aware of something that does not fit the pattern of a room, not with attention exactly, but with a quiet registration that Alistair read in those early days as the particular coolness of a king who had noted the tribute girl's presence and found nothing in it worth his interest. She had not come to the Ironhold expecting interest. She had come to pay her family's debt with her body's labor and her years, and, if it went well, to return to Vera with the ledger clear. That was the whole architecture of her intention, and she had packed it tight and kept it so. She told herself this on the narrow mornings when she watched Calder at council and felt the room reorganize itself around his attention. She told herself this when Devon, crossing the courtyard one afternoon, slowed his pace near her and said, without particular weight, that the king's wolves patrolled the tribute wing at night as a matter of protocol. Not because anyone was being watched, just because that was the protocol. She nodded. She thanked him. She did not ask why he had thought to tell her that. The feast of the autumn bond renewal was the 3rd week of her time at court, and it gathered the full assembly, all the ranked members of the Ironhold hierarchy, the Eastern delegation, the 3 tribute packs, the council, the standing war wolves, and the king. The great hall was lit with 112 candles along the central tables. Alistair counted them in the first 20 minutes because she needed something to do with her attention while Marin delivered a toast, and Lyra sat at the high table 6 seats from Calder, and the whole room performed the rituals of a court at ease with itself. Vera should not have been there. Vera had traveled to the Ironhold 3 days prior on the road between their home settlement and the nearest provisions town, and she had arrived at the outer gate with a sealed letter from the pack's remaining elder, requesting a single day's formal visit with her sister under the court's guest right. The request had been granted. The letter had been routed through proper channels, and Vera had sat at the feast's lower table looking wide-eyed at the candles and the ranked company and the stone ceiling 20 feet above. Marin had noticed her. It was a council aide who made the first move. A young man with the Ironhold bond seal on his left wrist, who leaned across the table and told Vera, in the easy register of someone stating a fact, that unseated tributes were not entitled to bring family guests under guest right, that the exemption applied only to formally bonded delegates, and that her presence was technically in violation of the court's hospitality charter. He said it quietly, but the people nearby heard it. Vera's face changed in the way a young woman's face changes when she understands that the ground she thought was solid is not. Alistair had been on the far side of the lower table. She crossed it. "The guest right charter," she said, when she reached the aid, extends to immediate family of any tribute representative during the period of active service. That is in the original bond settlement language. You may verify it with the council clerk before the next bell if you want to be certain. She did not raise her voice. She did not touch him. She stood, and she spoke the specific text from a document she had read 4 times in the Tribute Wing's small archive, because she had known, on some practical level, that knowing the text exactly was the kind of thing that would eventually matter. The aide did not respond. The moment held. Then Marin's voice came from the high table, dry as winter wood. "How spirited," Marin said. "The fallen pack's charity, defending its dependents at a king's feast. Let the record note her contribution." A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the nearest tables. Alistair felt it the way she had learned to feel such things, as a pressure against the skin that she let pass through, rather than into her. She sat down next to Vera, put her hand once over Vera's hand, and returned her attention to the candles. Calder had not moved visibly. He sat at the head of the high table and did not laugh. Devon, standing behind him, watched the Alpha King's jaw set, a small, specific thing, almost nothing. The muscles along the jaw doing what they do when a man is keeping something in. Alistair did not see that. She was looking at the candles. She had cost herself something in that moment. She understood it clearly enough. The aide would remember her as difficult. Marin had now publicly indexed her as presumptuous, a woman who elevated herself by defending a dependent she had no formal standing to defend. The court had laughed. These were real costs, and she paid them without hesitation. And that was the thing about her that Calder registered in the specific way the body registers something true. She had not calculated the cost, and decided it was acceptable. She had seen Vera's face, and moved. If you are finding this story worthwhile, stay with it. The moment that changes everything has not yet arrived, and it is specific, and it will not be what you expect. 3 days after the feast, the court received the Eastern delegation's formal proposal for Lyra's bonding consideration to the Alpha King. It was not the first such proposal. The Eastern Alliance had been presenting and withdrawing and re-presenting bond suits for 7 years, adjusting the terms with each iteration in the manner of people who believe the mechanism only needs the right configuration to succeed. This version came with a border settlement clause, a trade transit reallocation, and the full support of the Eastern Pact Council. Marin received it with visible satisfaction. Devon placed it in the review stack without comment. Lyra moved through the court that week with a new quality of confidence, something that had always been present in her becoming more visible. The way a fire in daylight is still present, but becomes unmistakable when the light dims. She stopped Alistair in the corridor outside the Bond Records Hall one afternoon. The corridor was narrow and cold, and the 2 women faced each other in the gray light from the high window above the stairwell. Lyra had 4 members of her delegation behind her and did not look at them before she spoke. "You should understand your position clearly," Lyra said. "You are a tribute payment, a line item in a blood debt ledger, a charity placement. There is no path in this court from where you are to anywhere worth occupying." She paused. The unbonded refuse of a broken pack does not accumulate standing at the iron hold. It waits out its term and returns to whatever is left of its home. She said the words cleanly, without heat, which was, Alistair thought, perhaps the most honest version of contempt. Hot contempt still contains the other person. This kind did not. "Thank you," Alistair said. Lyra waited for more. When it did not come, she walked on. Alistair stood in the corridor for a moment, her back against the stone, and let the cold from the wall move through her coat. The unbonded refuse of a broken pack. She turned the phrase in her mind the way you turn a stone to find its weight, not to keep it, but to know it exactly before you set it down. What she had not seen, because she had turned away before it happened, was Devon at the far end of the corridor, where he had been crossing toward the records hall. He stopped when he heard Lyra's words. He looked at Alistair's face when Lyra walked past him, and he went. Not to the records hall, but to the king's study. Calder received Devon's report standing at the window of his study, looking down at the courtyard where the first frost had silvered the stone. Devon said only what he had heard, the specific words, the corridor, the delegation present. The Alpha King did not turn from the window. The frost below caught the afternoon light and held it. His hand, resting on the window's stone frame, pressed once, briefly, and then released. He told Devon to make sure the Eastern delegation understood the Guest Right Charter's boundary provisions. He said it in the same voice he used for administrative instructions, flat and without emphasis. Devon nodded and left, and understood perfectly well that the instruction had nothing to do with the Guest Right Charter. It was the following week that the almost moment happened, and it was the smallest thing, which is how such moments often work. Alistair had stayed late in the Tribute Wing's small archive, reading the original bond settlement texts for the third time, because she had a specific question about the term end conditions, and when she finally closed the book and carried her candle out into the corridor, she found it empty in both directions except for Calder, who was coming from the council wing and had reached the corridor's junction at the same moment she had. They stopped. The candle she held lit the space between them, and nothing else. He was close enough that she could see the seam of his jaw in the low light. The line where the stillness he wore as authority had given way slightly to something that was not authority, a tiredness around the eyes that the day-lit hall never showed. She should have moved aside. She stepped back instead of to the side, which meant she was still in the middle of the corridor, which meant he had not walked on, and the candle between them made a small, steady world where neither of them had a prescribed position. He looked at the book under her arm. "The settlement texts," he said. "Not a question." "I had a question about the term end conditions," she said. "What was the question?" She told him, specifically, in the plain language she had been using in her own head, without softening it for a king's reception or elevating it for a court's formality. He listened. He did not interrupt. When she finished, he said, after a moment, that the term and conditions had been revised 17 years prior with an amendment that was filed separately from the main text, in the Records Hall's annex cabinet, third shelf, left side, in a green-bound volume with no title on the spine. She looked at him. "I had the same question once," he said. It was the most she had heard him say in the same number of words since she had arrived. She did not know what to do with it. She thanked him. She moved aside, the correct direction this time, and he walked on, and she stood in the corridor with the candle until his footsteps went quiet, and then she stood there a little longer. She did not tell herself it was nothing. She told herself it was administrative. A king who knew his own court's records thoroughly and answered a question because the answer was there and available. That was the story she assembled for herself in the archive corridor, and she kept it, because the alternative was something she had not packed room for. The moment Calder came to her chamber door 3 weeks later, at an hour when the court had settled into its night routines, was not in any document Alistair had read. He knocked, which she had not expected, and when she opened the door he stood in the corridor with no attendant and no stated reason beyond requesting a private word. She stepped back. He entered. He stood at the window while she stood near the door, the chamber between them and the courtyard's night frost visible through the glass. He offered her the crown. He said it plainly in the direct declarative register he used for everything, that the Ironhold required a queen, that the political machinery of the court had been running bond suit calculations for 7 years without resolution, that he had watched her in this court for 6 weeks and had not been able to stop seeing what she was, and that he was asking her to stand beside him as his queen. He said she could read the formal offer document before she answered. He said she could take a day. She was quiet for a long time, looking at the frost on the courtyard stone below the window. "No," she said. His stillness changed quality, not surprise. Something more interior than surprise. The stillness of a man hearing a word he had genuinely prepared for intellectually and still finds, arriving in sound a different weight than the preparation accounted for. "I cannot accept what is offered," she said carefully. "Without being chosen. That is not the same thing. A crown offered because the court's bond suit machinery has not resolved is not a choice. It is the next administrative solution. I would rather return to my sister with a cleared ledger than stand in a throne hall as a mechanism the king selected because the mechanism was available." She said it without heat, the way Lyra had said her contempt, because the most honest things are said in the same register, flat and without performance. Calder looked at her for a long time. Then he walked to the door and stopped there, and said, without turning back to face her, that he understood her. He left without the door making any sound behind him. She stood there for a long time after. What she did not know was that the refusal changed things in a direction she had not accounted for. She had expected distance, a formal cooling, the king's reorientation toward Lyra's suit. She had not expected what Devon told her 2 days later in the courtyard, not directly, but in the way he had learned to deliver information to her, in a passing sentence that contained more than it announced. "The Eastern Alliance's bond proposal review period expires in 4 days," he said, moving past her. "The council meets on the morning of the 5th day to formalize the election mechanism. Marin has scheduled it." He kept walking. She stood in the courtyard and worked through what that meant. It meant that Marin had not waited for Calder's private decision to resolve. It meant the council had its own mechanism, the bonding election clause, buried in the Ironhold's founding charter, which allowed the senior council to initiate a formal bond right for the Alpha King in the absence of the king's own declaration, if the court's political stability could be argued to require it. It was an emergency provision, not used in 4 generations, and Marin had been laying the groundwork to invoke it since before Alistair had arrived. The forced bond right would name Lyra. It would lock the claim through council authority. And once locked through that mechanism, even the Alpha King's override would require a full elder tribunal to unravel, which would take months and cost political capital that the Ironhold's current border situation could not afford. That was what Marin had built, slowly, carefully, over 7 years of bond suit iterations, using each refusal to tighten the legal architecture of the provision she was planning to invoke. Alistair went back to the archive. She found the green-bound amendment volume on the 3rd shelf, left side, no title on the spine, exactly where he had said it would be. She read it twice. She read the founding charter's bonding election clause 4 times. She sat at the small table in the archive's cold light and thought about what a woman with no standing, no bond seal, and no political leverage could do against a council mechanism that had been built over 7 years by a woman who had never once been required to doubt her own authority. She found one thing. The forced bond right required a willing recipient. That provision was in the original charter language, not the amendment. A single phrase in old pack law that Marin had apparently determined was a formality rather than a structural requirement. A willing recipient, or in the absence of willingness, a representative of the candidate's immediate blood standing present to confirm consent. Lyra's blood-standing representatives were all members of the Eastern delegation, who were all political allies of the bond suit and who had every incentive to confirm consent regardless of Lyra's actual state. But the rite itself was a physical ceremony, conducted in the council chamber, witnessed by the assembled court, and it required a ceremonial bonding object, a cord of braided silver and stone, to be held by the candidate at the moment of declaration. If the cord was severed before the declaration completed, the rite was void. Alistair was not in the council chamber the morning of the 5th day when Marin opened the session. She was in the corridor outside it, with the archive's small stone letter opener in her coat pocket, and 7 minutes before the ceremony's declaration sequence would complete. Marin stood at the chamber's center, the council arranged in their formal arc, Lyra holding the braided cord with the expression of someone who has won something and is still in the process of understanding how completely. The Eastern delegation stood at the left wall. The court's assembled witnesses filled the standing space. Calder sat in the king's chair at the chamber's head, his expression unreadable, his hands flat on the armrests, because a king who unilaterally blocked the emergency election provision without grounds would hand Marin the tribunal argument she needed. Alistair came in through the side door. She walked to the center of the room. Marin saw her and stopped mid-phrase, the declaration hanging in the air between the start of the sentence and the end. The room went very still, the 300 witnesses and the council and the delegation all turning, the way a current turns when an unexpected weight enters water. "The right requires a willing recipient," Alistair said, in the same voice she had used with the aide at the feast, no louder than necessary, because the room was already listening. "The candidate cannot confirm her own consent. The charter language requires an independent witness to the court holding." She reached the center of the room and stood 2 feet from Lyra. "I am invoking the witness provision of the bonding election clause. As a court-registered tribute representative, I have standing to demand a compliance verification before the declaration completes." Marin's face did something Alistair had not seen it do before. The patient authority of it developed a crack, small and immediate. The crack that appears when a mechanism a person has spent 7 years building encounters, a variable that was not supposed to be present. "You have no standing to invoke a charter provision," Marin said. "The founding charter does not restrict the witness provision by bond status," Alistair said. "Only by court registration. I am registered. The clerk's record is current." She looked at Lyra. "Do you hold this cord willingly?" Lyra looked at the cord. She looked at Alistair. She looked at Calder. Calder had not moved. His hands were still flat on the armrests, but something in the quality of his stillness had changed, the same fractional shift Devon had noted at the tribute ceremony 7 weeks ago, and this time it was visible to the room, the absolute focused attention of a man watching something happen that he has not been able to make happen himself. Lyra's hands opened. The cord dropped onto the stone floor. Not because she was weak, not because she did not want the crown, because she had looked at Calder's face in the moment after Alistair spoke, and she had seen what was there, and she was, at her core, too intelligent and too honest to hold a cord for a man whose attention was on someone else. Marin reached for the cord. "The declaration," she said, her voice recovering its surface authority. The declaration had not been voided. The candidate's intention remained. The right could be reinitiated with the representative's formal statement of consent on record. Alistair picked up the cord first. She did not hold it. She took the letter opener from her coat pocket and she cut it. 3 strokes through the braided silver, because the braid was designed to be continuous, and the right's void provision required severance. And she had done the arithmetic on this in the archive 4 days ago. The chamber was completely silent. Then Calder rose from the king's chair. He did not speak immediately. He stood, and the room absorbed his standing the way it had always absorbed him, the air moving differently, the witnesses stepping back an inch without understanding why. He walked from the king's chair to the center of the chamber, where Alistair stood with the letter opener still in her hand and the severed cord at her feet. Marin said his name. Her voice held the first note of fear. He looked at her, and what was in that look accomplished something that 7 years of tribunal procedure would not have. Marin sat down. Not because she was commanded to, but because she understood in the animal part of herself that pack law and council seating had been covering for decades, that whatever authority she had been invoking was no longer present in the room. Calder turned to the council. Elder Marin invoked the emergency election provision of the founding charter without royal consultation, without the required 72-hour notification period, and without the willing recipient verification that the charter explicitly requires. He paused. The right is void. The provision is rescinded. Marin's seat on the council is suspended pending a full charter compliance review. He looked at the clerk at the far table. Record it. The clerk's quill moved. Marin did not stand again. Calder then did something the room had not prepared for. He turned to Alistair. He was close enough now that the torchlight between them was the same small world as the corridor with the candle. The same quality of space where the court's prescribed positions did not quite reach. He looked at her face for a moment, and the look was not the king's administrative registration that she had been reading for 7 weeks. It had the quality of a man looking at something that has cost him to see, not because it is difficult to look at, but because the looking confirms something he has not been able to dismiss. I asked you once, he said, in terms that were not adequate. I am asking again, in the only terms that are. He extended his hand, open, palm up, the way you extend a hand when you are not asking for compliance but offering a direction. Will you stand with me? He said. Not for the court, not for the charter. Because I am asking you, and you are the only one I am asking, and if you refuse again, I will not ask through any other mechanism. The hall was silent in the specific way it is silent when 300 witnesses understand they are present at something that will outlast them. She had told herself, in the archive corridor, and in her chamber after the private refusal, and in the 4 days since, that she had come to the Ironhold to clear a ledger and return to her sister. She had told herself that she was not the kind of woman the most powerful man in this world looked at twice. She had packed that belief with the care of someone who has lived inside it long enough to know it is the only thing keeping the architecture standing. She looked at his open hand. She looked at his face, which had stopped being a mask somewhere in the 7 weeks between her arrival and this moment, and which held, in the torch-lit silence of the council chamber, the specific expression of a man who has arrived at the only choice he is willing to make, and is waiting, without certainty, to see what it costs him. She put her hand in his. The room exhaled. Not in unison, not theatrically, but in the way rooms exhale when a door that has been pressing against its frame for a long time is finally opened. The witnesses along the walls shifted. The council members looked at one another. Lyra, near the left wall, looked at her hands for a moment, and then lifted her eyes to the front of the room, and something in her face settled into an expression that was not defeat, but adjustment. The look of an intelligent woman recalculating the path ahead. She would leave the Ironhold the following morning, and she would leave with her delegation intact and her political standing undiminished. And whatever conversation she had with herself on the road home was her own. Davon stood at the chamber's back wall and looked at his king's face, and what he saw there was something he had been noting in small increments since the tribute ceremony: the fractional shifts, and the quiet instructions and the corridor conversation that had reached him secondhand. He had not been certain, across those weeks, whether what he was seeing was real, or whether he was reading meaning into the ordinary behavior of a king who paid precise attention to everything. He was certain now. He was, in the way of a good beta who has served a long time, quietly glad, and he let the gladness be visible for exactly the duration of one breath before he put it back. Vera was not in the council chamber. She had traveled back to the Pax home settlement 2 weeks before, carrying the letter Alistair had written to her with news that the court was, for the time being, adequately navigated. She was in the settlement's kitchen when the Ironhold courier arrived with the sealed message, and she broke the seal standing at the table with flour still on her hands, and she read the letter twice, and then she sat down on the bench where she had been sleeping the night Alistair had signed the tribute parchment, and she held the letter against her chest for a long time. The formal elevation occurred 4 days after the council chamber in the throne hall, under the full assembly. The council had been reconstituted without Marin, whose compliance review had already surfaced 3 additional procedural violations, and who would eventually be reduced to non-voting observer status and nothing further, because the new order had no interest in making a lesson of her beyond the exposure of the specific failures she had built. The Eastern Alliance delegation had returned home. The throne hall held its full witness roster, the ranked members of the Ironhold, the 3 tribute pack representatives, the war wolves along the walls. Alistair stood on the dais in the dress the Chamberlain had brought without Alistair having requested it. A deep green that was nothing like the tribute wing's assigned attire, and her hands were at her sides and her chin was level, and the hall was watching her, the way it had watched her at the tribute ceremony 7 weeks before, except that the quality of the watching was different now. The inventory had changed its purpose. Calder spoke the formal declaration of his own hand, without council mediation, because the Alpha King's direct declaration superseded every procedural requirement the Ironhold's founding charter contained. He spoke her full name once, Alistair of the Fallen Pack, and the Ironhold both, and the doubling of it was the specific formal acknowledgement that she carried 2 standings now, the one she had arrived with, and the one she was given, and the court was required to record both. He placed the seal cord around her wrist, not the severed cord from the council chamber, but the king's own braided silver, which was a different thing, and his hands were steady, and when the cord rested on her wrist, the hall tolled the bell, the single low note that traveled through the floor, the same sound that had accompanied her arrival. She felt it in the soles of her feet again, as she had felt it 7 weeks ago. But the stone was not cold anymore, or she was not barefooted, or the sound was, finally, for her. Vera arrived at the Ironhold 3 days after the elevation, traveling with 2 pack members and the same small bag she had carried every time she had visited. And she walked through the outer gate and was brought, not to the guest right wing, but to the family rooms adjacent to the Queen's chambers, because that was the instruction that had been filed with the Chamberlain before her arrival. She found Alistair in the corridor outside the archive, with the green-bound amendment volume under her arm, because she had gone back to return it to the 3rd shelf, left side, where it belonged. Vera looked at her sister standing in the torchlit corridor of the Ironhold's tribute wing, which was no longer precisely the tribute wing, because the Chamberlain had already begun to redesignate its rooms for other purposes, and she said, after a moment, the way younger sisters say the most important things, in the plainest language available to them, "You look like yourself." Alistair looked, down at the green-bound volume and then at her sister, and then at the corridor, which she had walked every morning for 7 weeks, as a woman measuring her welcome in a court that had not given her one. The walls were the same stone. The torches were the same torches. The archive door at the end of the hall was the same door she had been cautious about opening in the early weeks, as though using it too freely would alert someone to the fact that she had decided to know where she was. The door was open. It was open because she had left it open on her way out. She set the green-bound volume on the shelf where it belonged, and she walked out, and she left the door open behind her. The ledger had been cleared, not by leaving but by staying, and by being, in the one way she had always been, exactly herself, which was the thing the hierarchy had never been able to account for, and which had been, in the end, the only currency the king had wanted.